Welcome to Valor and Virtue. I'm Jim Danielson. Today we have with us Petty Officer First Class George Clark, United States Marine Corps retired. Petty Officer Clark was a corpsman in the Navy, and we'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to become a corpsman in the Navy.
I was 18 when I signed up. By the time I went to boot camp, due to the delayed entry program, it was 3 months later, so I just turned 19. This was in 1975. To get to your question, being a corpsman looked professional. It looked fairly easy to grasp and easy to learn. And it basically was my ticket away from home and being a grown man, because I just graduated high school. I didn't have stars in my eyes or anything like that, but I'm from St. Louis. I wanted to get the heck out of St. Louis. And I wanted to be on my own. And so when the Navy recruiter called me and I went down for my initial sit-down interview, and he said, "Well, what do you think you'd like to do in the Navy?" And that opened up an interesting aspect with me, because I knew nothing about the Navy at that time. I thought, okay, you get on a ship and you sail. And that was my simplistic view. But of course, when I was confronted, well, what do you actually want to do in the Navy? And of course, they had the occupational manual, and we're flipping through. And I saw this picture of a corpsman in a hospital, of course. And I said, that looks professional. I says to myself, that looks professional. It looks like it'd be easy to learn. And it looks like a nice soft berth. So on the basis of that alone, of course, mind you, I'm 18, 19. I picked that. There's nothing more to it than that at that point. That's what led me to be a corpsman, quite honestly, at that point.
Well, now there was another question I was going to ask
Yes.
you. Perhaps we can get to it, but what you just said makes me want to sort of run this by you. You're that age. You take a decision that we could agree, wouldn't it, is largely uninformed.
Yes.
But it sets you off on a life path.
The trajectory it set me on, I could have never anticipated. No.
Yeah. So it's like, you have to at least get started.
Yes.
You know, and that's, you didn't want to be in St. Louis. You wanted to get out on your own.
Yes.
Right. You get started. And gosh, turned out well.
It did. It totally changed my life. I was always sort of caregiving oriented. So if anything else other than what I've just said, that made it seem logical for me. I was used to taking care of people.
Sure.
You know. And I think the fact that I was an only child had a lot to do with the drive to break out and do something, you know.
Now, where's, when you leave boot camp, you go to school.
Yes.
Now, what do you call that? A school?
That would be a school, hospital course school.
And where was that?
That was San Diego.
Now, when you were going through that, did you think it was easy to learn?
No, that was and my first awakening to the complex situation I'd gotten myself into.
Oh, yes, sure.
Of course, it's a 12-week course. It's a very comprehensive, very concentrated. You have to learn a lot in a short time. And so it was challenging, to say the least. But, you know, it was too late to turn back or anything.
That's right, yeah.
And I didn't, okay, we're going to get to this sooner or later anyway. When I found out about the Navy Marine Corps connection, it wasn't until I got in school, because the recruiter didn't say anything whatever about the Marine Corps.
That's unusual, don't you think?
We'll leave that alone. But so we were on class break. This was about two or three, no, not even that, maybe 1 or 2 weeks into the A school course. We were on class break, which was 3 or 4 minutes usually between subject matter courses. And we're all hanging out. And the class was about 45 of us, maybe. And our instructor walks in, calls us to attention. He says, this is not part of the course now. But he says, I have but 2 facts to impart upon you gentlemen. And like we're all smart aleck kids, basically. Median age from anywhere from 18 to 22, 23. There were a couple of old guys who had been to college or were previously enlisted. But anyway, he says, the United States Marine Corps falls under the Department of the United States Navy. He pauses for effect about 10 or 15 seconds. He takes a breath and says, the United States Marine Corps does not itself possess a medical corps. I don't know if those were the exact words, but he was imparting that the Marine Corps of it in itself didn't have a medical corps. And he exits the room. And by this time, we're just out of boot camp, most of us. We're used to these mind games.
Right, yep.
And we're like, what is the blanking riddle that he wants us to figure out? You know, what does that have to do with us being here? And about 10 seconds go by and we're scratching our heads. And then all of a sudden, this one guy in the back of the room says, "Oh, expletive." And we're
He's
like,
becoming a Marine already.
And we are blessedly at this moment in time clueless.
Right.
And he says, my father is a retired Marine. He says, and a lot of his best friends were corpsmen. But he says they weren't like us. And we're like, what do you mean? He says, these guys were actually stationed with my father. He said they were part of his unit. And most of us, this was, at that moment in time, too much of a nightmare to even contemplate. And we're like, what are you talking about? You know, they don't have nothing to do with us. They didn't tell us nothing about this in boot camp, you know. And so anyway, that was the first dawning of what we were truly getting into. And so this tangent that I just went through was my first awakening of the Navy Marine Corps connection. And then, of course, our instructor fleshed it out that it was standard protocol that approximately half of any class was sent to the FMF. And we were fully able to absorb the body blow at that point. But I guess that's kind of a long way around of answering your initial question.
And you fell into the lucky half.
Not at that point.
Oh, really?
Amazingly. That it didn't happen. I went through my first 4 years as a blue side corpsman. I went to school immediately after Corps school to become an ophthalmic assistant, an eye doctor's assistant. That's a sub MOS, other than just being a corpsman. I went to school immediately after that, graduated from that school, got sent to Philadelphia Naval Hospital for 2 years. That was my first permanent duty station. Then I got sent in the last year, my first 4-year tour, I got sent to an aircraft carrier. That wasn't so easy. It was 5,900 people with the air wing aboard. The sick calls were massive. And that was my first taste of what it was like to be a basic corpsman, because there was no optometrist or ophthalmologic doctor officer on board. So I was just deployed basically as a quad zero corpsman, a basic corpsman. So that was shock therapy for me, because I had been tucked away in an eye clinic for almost 3 years, and all of a sudden I'm thrown to the wolves. But I needed that, because that educated me on what being a basic corpsman was, and I needed that.
Now, I imagine when you were on the aircraft carrier, there was a detachment of aviation Marines.
There were.
Did you have
120.
Mm-hmm.
And we were charged with taking care of them, because they needed corpsmen just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And their detachment didn't have a separate detachment of corpsmen. So they went through our sick call system. And that was I wasn't with them at that point like I would be later, but that was my first contact with the Marine Corps. And it was very comprehensive, like the aircraft carrier experience was as a whole. It was shock therapy for me, because the sick calls were massive. They could go up to 175 a day, because there were 2 sick calls, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so you're talking 50 to 75 people per sick call. You times that by 2. So it was the whole aircraft carrier experience was like an industrial city.
Sure.
And the sick calls were like you were working for General Motors or Ford.
Almost like on an assembly line. Would you be working with other corpsmen?
Oh, yes. There were about 45 of us.
Wow.
Well, you had a complement of 5,900 people on the carrier. So even at 45, we were a bit shorthanded. It was adequate, but it was tight. You had to turn over. And that's what I meant by shock therapy, because you
Oh,
had to
right, sure.
handle a bunch of people medically in a very short time, tend to their needs if they were sick, maintain their health if they were healthy. And there were always inoculations and vaccines, because you were on deployment, you were going all these different places in the world, and the challenge was to stay medically astute and ready. And here I was in the last year of my first enlistment, and I learned all this in this environment.
Now, that's interesting. So you have this immersion kind of
Yes,
at this point. Now, I would imagine that that kind of immersion had the effect of really deepening your knowledge of what it was you
it
did.
did. It also gave me insight into what my true role in the military was. You are not only a caregiver, you maintained these guys, you fortified them so they could do their job. And in doing so, you had to be intimate with certain aspects of what they did, and you had to participate in order that you knew and were at least up to the challenge of fortifying them because of what they were going through. So it was like a progressive chain. You were pulled further and further in, whether you wanted to be or not.
That is, let me ask you if you would agree with this. So you're becoming a better corpsman all the time, but in a very real way, you're also becoming an active, participating citizen
Yes.
of this community.
And that's the important part. I mean, your corpsman skills, your purely medical skills are very important. I'm not saying
Of
they're
course, yeah.
not. But in order for you to be adaptable to what they're going through, you can't be a bystander. You have to be a participant, sometimes whether you want it to be or not. And given my level of maturity at that point, which was fast evolving, sometimes I was aware of this immersion, sometimes I wasn't. But that year of immersion, and that's a good term, by the way, that year of immersion was probably galvanizing for me.
Did you find yourself at times having to pull together the discipline to focus on something you just didn't want to do?
Yes. And I don't think that could be overstated, because when you're made to do something you don't want to do, and you're made to do it repeatedly, and there's no alternative to it, that's what builds the discipline itself.
That's well said. Yes, that's what builds it. Now, do you think it also sort of built in you a certain kind of self-reliance and confidence in yourself?
Oh, very much, because at the end of that year on the aircraft carrier, I was a totally different service member than when I first reported aboard, because I was doing many things as a routine that at the outset of it, I didn't think I would be even capable of learning, because of the pace of it, mainly because I had to learn things fast. I had to be used to being uncomfortable while I'm figuring out things. And I think when I first reported aboard the Eisenhower, it was the Dwight D. Eisenhower CVN 69, by the way.
By the way, you and my brother were there at the same time on the Eisenhower.
Small world.
Yeah, small world.
But I lost my train of thought.
The discipline of focusing on doing something well that you don't want to do. And
in an uncomfortable, at times uncomfortable situation, made me a better man and transformed me, in a sense, to being used to applying myself as opposed to just doing what I was ordered to do.
So you're starting to think for yourself,
yes,
act on your own.
And that was tremendously, I found myself being gratified that I was able to rise to the challenge. And I think that was my coming of age as a corpsman.
That's excellent. We talk about young people, and certainly true. You and I are the same age. Young men, you need a challenge to overcome.
Yes.
To sort of make you feel like, okay, I can take life. I can do it.
And the time period I'm speaking of, there were a lot of parallels to what we're experiencing today, or more accurately, what our young people in the military are experiencing today. Because remember, we're talking 78, 79 by now. It's almost as immediate post-Vietnam as you could get.
That's right, yeah. Oh,
that's another point I want to make. All my superior petty officers, almost all of them, and for that matter, the staff NCO, the NCOs and staff NCOs that were in the MARDET, a lot of them at that point were Vietnam vets.
Wow.
These are guys who were 5, 6, 7 years older than I was at that point. Their senior staff, their NCOs, their staff NCOs, and a lot of them were the tail end of the active part of Vietnam. So these were our mentors, and they felt an obligation to prepare us for whatever it was they had gone through, their coming of age, what they learned, what they experienced. They were determined to pass it on to us so we would be prepared, in a lot of cases more prepared than they were, for whatever was coming up next.
That's, it's important, but society in general has to be like that.
Yes.
If we don't accurately prepare the next generation for life, they're going to struggle more than they should.
Yes. And this was another aspect of that immersion that we spoke of early.
Right.
Because all my immediate mentors and instructors had this one central goal in mind. They were going to inoculate us, instruct us, so that we would be prepared, so that we wouldn't be as vulnerable as perhaps they felt when they were going through their experiences, however traumatic they may have been. But they wanted the next generation that they were instructing, that they were nurturing, to be more protected in a self-reliant way.
So these clearly were men who took every aspect of their work seriously.
Yes.
Including preparing the next generation of us.
And if they had to traumatize us a little to do it, they were not above that.
Good.
I'll just put it that way.
Well, now, as you're going along, do you end up mentoring younger
Yes,
corpsmen
but
behind
that's later. But anyway, let's close out
Sure, yeah.
this. So I get to the end of my first hitch, which was 4 years, 75 to 79. I decided I was all about re-enlisting, but I wanted to re-enlist to get off the Eisenhower because, like I said, the sick calls were massive. We had gone on a 7-month cruise. 6 months was usually the standard, but because we were on a nuclear aircraft carrier, and at the time, the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet, because it was new, it was barely 1 year out of commissioning when I reported. So everything had to be top notch, which meant we were working 28 hours a day, 8 days a week, it felt like. And there was never any let up. And at the time my 4-year hitch came to a close and I was up for enlistment. By this time, I'm a petty officer 3rd class, senior petty officer 3rd class. I'm up for 2nd class. I thought, well, I want to stay in the Navy because this hasn't worked out badly, but I want to get the heck off this ship.
Right.
They told me, well, you have to do another training cycle, which is roughly 8 or 9 months, and then you have to do another deployment. And of course, by this time, I'm 23 years old. And just enough confidence to be dangerous. And so I said, no. I said, if this is all you have to offer, I'm out of here. Being rash. So I got out. And I thought, since they wouldn't give me what I wanted, which that was the selfish part of me that had not been extinguished, even with the better qualities that experience gave me. I still wanted what I wanted, and that was not another year and a half on the Eisenhower, taking care of almost 6,000 people. So I got out September of 79 and went back to St. Louis, which I almost knew immediately was a mistake. Because, like I said, by this time I'm 23, it's 4 years later. I was not in any way, shape, or form ready to be a civilian after what I had just been through, but I didn't know that then. I just thought I'd go back and everything would be the same as it was, but I wasn't the same as I was. And initially, when I first got back home after the novelty of no longer being under strict lock and key anymore wore off, I was almost frightened at how much I had changed, because I went back to my same old friends I'd graduated high school with, none of whom had been in the military. And I saw how different I was, and I felt almost like a freak at first.
Now, would you say when you sort of reunited with your high school friends, did you get the sense that, man, these guys haven't advanced much at all since we graduated?
That's exactly the point I'm getting to. not that I didn't still care for them, but I had, and I'm not saying this to be smug, but I had broken out of the box and experienced things. Oh, a couple of them had gotten married, but they were in the same, basically, because we're all the same age, they're in this pretty much the same mindset that they were in 75.
Right, right.
I had grown up in that sense. I'd become more responsible and, to even my surprise, a lot more disciplined than I thought I was. And that created a gap between us. Although the friendship was still there, we were different people. We had different standards. And at first I was in denial. I said, oh, I just need to get over it and get back in the swing of things. But that wasn't going to happen. I saw things a lot differently. I wasn't in any way dependent on my parents. In fact, when I first moved back in, I insisted on paying them rent because I didn't want to be reabsorbed
Sure. Right.
as the 19-year-old that I was when I left. I wanted to keep that door open. Even if it was subconscious, I still wanted to be my own person. A lot of them were still satisfied being adjacent to their original family unit.
Sure.
Which, that's not anti-family.
No.
But they weren't willing to fully break away from the nest. They had that safety net. When they messed up, they could always go back. But I was a little bit beyond that because of my experience. And the longer I stayed, the longer I knew it. Then, let's see, November 4th, 1979, the Iran hostage crisis emerged, or, just came on the scene. And that was very dramatic for us as traumatic for us as a country, because it was the first time we had to face terrorism straight out. They had all these hostages. It was just a mess. I felt immediately restless. I mean, I was pissed off like everybody else, but I felt immediately restless because by this time I had insight that most civilians did not.
That's right.
I had training, even if it was peripheral, because I was a corpsman. I had training as to how these things would actually be addressed and dealt with. I was very frustrated with the Carter administration because of their passive stance. I was very frustrated, very at unease. I remember that was the first rumblings of me thinking I wanted to re-enlist. It did take 3 or 4 months for me to come fully to that realization. And on the dawn of the 5th month, I acted on it and re-enlisted. Of course, I wasn't, the way things played out, I had virtually no chance of being deployed to that situation because, as you know, it lasted over a year. There was the debacle in the desert.
That's right, yeah.
They dispersed all the hostages. It took the incoming Reagan administration to break that log jam. So when I decided to re-enlist because my civilian career wasn't working out, I was lucky enough that I did get a job right away, such as it was, but I wasn't, because of the hostage situation and because of, like I said before, how I had changed, I was not comfortable reintegrating back into civilian. Sure. Because I knew my purpose lay elsewhere. So finally, in spite of myself, I re-enlisted.
Now, was it roughly at about that time that you were sent to the Marines?
Yes, in a sense. I had migrated before I re-enlisted at the suggestion of a couple of service-related friends, people I had been stationed with in my first enlistment. I relocated to San Diego, of all places.
Wow.
And that was 3 months prior to my enlisting. But me being in San Diego, which is essentially a military town,
right,
sealed the deal. It was a Navy military town, and my own restlessness, my move to San Diego merely became an interlude to my re-enlistment into the Navy. And the first place I was sent after re-enlistment, faithfully, was MCRD San Diego, branch clinic. And whatever questions you want to ask after that, I'm sure are pertinent. But in a sense, at that point, the rest was history, because that was my first partial integration into the Marine Corps, into the Marine Corps way of thinking. And from that point, there was no turning back. I was on a Marine Corps base. I was at a Marine Corps training facility, right, so I could see the installation of Marine Corps values firsthand. And I was actually a part of that. And that pretty much sealed the deal for me for the rest of my career.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't want to jump ahead. I know our time is not limitless, but I do have to say, at this point, I almost knew I would never be strictly blue side again, because being stationed at MCRD San Diego, for protocol as well as historical reasons, is an event in itself.
Sure, yeah.
And it's not something you can shake off or wash off at the end of 2 or 3 years, or however long you're there. You're pretty much indoctrinated from that point on. And that was the case for me. Now, I'm sure you have specific questions concerning what I just said, so I'll just let you ask them. But I had to say that.
No, I'm glad you did. What I thought was, well, a number of things, but really interesting about this is you suggest a kind of noticeable difference in style between the way the Navy operates and the way the Marine Corps.
Yes. The Marine Corps is definitely more, it's not just about protocol, it's duty, it's camaraderie. That is much more emphasized than it is with the Navy. The Navy is more specifically environmentally based or mission based. The Marine Corps is more your military identity. It's not just that, okay, we're stationed here, we've got to do this, we've got to have it done by a certain time, and then we move on to the next thing. It's almost like it's incidental that you happen to be in the Navy. Whereas with the Marine Corps, and this is almost cliche, but not to those of us who have been involved, you're a Marine first. Your identity is forged in that brotherhood. The missions and everything are important, but the reason you exist to do these missions is that you're part of this band of brothers. You're part of the Marine Corps. And it wasn't very long after I was stationed at MCRD San Diego till I became almost at a subliminal level first. Then I became fully conscious that this was the deal. Mm. And I was humbled at first to be peripherally a part of it. Then by and by that humility became more connected, and I was actually proud to be whatever part of it I could, to be included. I mean, once that awakening comes, there's really no turning back. Once you become aware of that, there's really no turning back. It was at that point I knew I was going to be an FMF corpsman, because the great thing about being in San Diego, you're only 40 miles from I'm having a lapse.
That
here.
happens sometimes.
But I was only the camp out there, the counterpart to Camp Lejeune.
Is it Pendleton?
Pendleton. You're only 40 miles from Pendleton. You had periodically these FMF corpsmen, these 8404s, coming down for supplies, for training. You know, I saw their uniforms. I saw how they comparted themselves. I saw how much a part of the Marine Corps they were. It wasn't like they were accessories of the Marine Corps. They were part of it. And perhaps selfishly, being that I felt as I did already, I wanted that. I wanted all or nothing at all.
Yes, I have to tell you, over many years running into people who've served roughly, and you and I were basically in at the same time, I have never heard anybody say something like that. And that is really impressive and moving. We're sort of running out of time, but
Okay.
no, we're good. You
I've talked too much.
no, you haven't. You haven't. But you, in a sense, you're. It sounds like you're talking about being on the cusp of, in a sense, becoming a Marine. In terms of your mindset,
Yes.
your discipline, and
In,
all of
in
that.
terms of my mindset, yes. But I want to rush things along out of necessity because I want you to get kind of the whole
Yeah, sure.
kernel of what I'm trying to say. So I was there for 2 years, from 80 to 82. I went to Okinawa, independent duty tour for 18 months to Camp Kui Hospital, which later became Camp Lester. In fact, that happened while I was there. Camp Lester was a World War II corpsman who distinguished himself and all that. And it was renamed in honor of him. I was stationed at the branch clinic at Camp Foster. I was there. And it was at that point that I decided I was going to, not that I just wanted to be, but I was going to be an FMF corpsman. And I started putting in requests for a lateral transfer to become an 8404, which I still wasn't by this time. My friends, my other corpsman comrades thought I had lost my mind. They were like, why would you're comfortable, you're safe, why would you want to go to the Fleet Marine Force? Why? I'm like, I have to. I says, by this time, of course, I knew I was going to be in the Navy for 20 years at least. The field I was in was very narrow. There wasn't a lot of room for advancement unless somebody died or retired. And I knew my skills that I had learned on the carrier were starting to erode because I hadn't had a chance to really practice them. I said, if I'm going to advance at all, and if I'm going to reach my true potential as a corpsman, by this time I fully realized that. I said, this is my last chance to be what I want to be. Plus, time was catching up with me. By this time, I'm 26.
Sure. You can feel old age coming.
I told, in fact, of course, in Okinawa, you can only talk to your monitors, the people who determine where you were going to be sent next, by Audubon. Remember Audubon?
I've heard of it. I don't remember that one.
It was a military phone system that's absolutely obsolete now. But in '83, there were no cell phones. There were damn few satellites, and communication for the average Joe was still strictly analog. Audubon was just an analog system that was direct from military to military unit. And we're talking, and they, by protocol, when you were within, say, 6 months of being transferred, you had to connect with your monitor and negotiate with him. And by this time, I had already sent in 2 or 3 special requests to transfer, and they were denied because they thought I was a kook. So I finally get to talk to him when I'm over in Okinawa. Oh, That's it. Because I was in Okinawa, they actually had to come in person once a year to face with you. And this is where I convinced them that I wanted to go to the FMF. I wanted to go to school, become an FMF corpsman, and then I wanted to go to a forward unit, which was absolute insanity because this was 1983. The Beirut thing was hovering. The blast hadn't happened yet, and it had been pretty much a stalemate at that point. This is June, July of 83 when we're talking face to face. And I finally convinced him that I was not some nutso case and that I was actually sincere and focused in what I wanted to do. So they finally complied. And like I said, my other brethren thought I had just lost my mind, especially at that particular time. So when I finished there, I got transferred here, and I arrived 4 days after the Beirut blast.
Wow.
It happened the 23rd. I arrived here the 27th.
What was it like here?
Things were crazy and in very high gear. I mean, things coalesced there was, of course, shock and all that, but things coalesced very quickly here. And I was scared, yes, but I was excited to be a part of that because it felt like you were in the center of a vortex.
Right, sure.
You didn't know how things were going to turn out. And at that point, we didn't. But went through the course, out-chopped, graduated December 7th, got sent to 2-6. 2-6, by coincidence, was the rescue BLT that had just gotten back from rescue and recovery after the Beirut blast. So again, another immersion. By extension, yes, but these were people who had been on the ground in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
And the things they saw, again, this was a pivotal time for us as a military, because just like the Iran hostage crisis, this was another terrorist incursion, only much more direct.
That's right. Yeah.
And to wrap this up, because I know we are running out of time, literally the rest of my career was based out of here, was out of Camp Lejeune, except for 4 years in between my 2 tours that I went to, what else? Paris, Holland.
Oh, great.
I was there 4 years.
Did the sand fleas get you?
Oh, yes. To expedite things, there was nothing there other than a much more profound historical sense.
Sure, right.
That hadn't happened at MCRD San Diego.
Right.
But now the only difference is I was no longer peripheral.
That's right. Oh,
I
right.
was
in it,
thoroughly immersed.
Right.
And that's where my career as a mentor really started. Because by this time, I'm in my early to mid 30s.
Sure, yeah.
There are young corpsmen under me.
Right.
And I'm passing all of this on to them, because by then I had done a 3-year tour up here 2-6, and Headquarters Battalion combined. 2-6 was the lengthier, it was 25 months. Headquarters Battalion was a year. I did 1 or 2 deployments, and did winter mountain warfare training in Bridgeport, California, which was an experience in itself. I won't go into detail. But so that was my first tour here. Then the 4 years at Parris Island. Then my final 5 years back here, which meant 2 more deployments.
Sure.
And that brings me to my last deployment, where that it was a fitting way for an old FMF corpsman to end up.
Sure.
Because I was within the space of 3 years, 2.5 years, I did almost back-to-back med deployments. One with 2-4, which was then a part of 6th Marine Regiment. It was a med cruise. It was what it was, but it was, in terms of what could happen, it was pretty routine. It was uneventful. They saved the best and the worst for last. I got transferred to 1-8 after 2-4. I was told it was for training purposes. I was, of course, lied to. I did a training cycle, then I ended up going on yet another and my last med deployment. And that was pivotal, both pivotal and eventful, because within the same deployment, which it was anything but routine, we were almost immediately after we cross-decked at Rota, we were almost immediately, this is 1-8. We were sent to the Adriatic Sea, which was the outskirts of Bosnia,
Right.
because the whole BOT was designated to be the peacekeeping force when the Bosnia Accord was signed, which in late summer, early fall of '93 seemed imminent. So we had been staged and fully vetted and everything to be the BOT landing peacekeeping force. You know, shades of Beirut again.
Sure, yeah.
But and we were there for the better part of a month. Then came Black Hawk Down in Somalia. We were the whole BOT within the period of 10, 11 days was totally removed from Bosnia, because that very suddenly became low priority.
Right.
And they were at a stalemate anyway. There weren't any active hostilities going on by this time. And we were transported to literally the other side of the world. Within 10, 11 days, we were Tutumu, an armada of almost 30 ships. We were Tutumu. We were joined by the 13th BU out off the West Coast. They were snatched out of their regular rotation. We formed a 64-ship armada off the coast of Somalia. And that was the career capping experience, because we were there for 32 days. we were after action. We were strictly rescue, recovery, humanitarian, and there was a lot of work to do. Not only because of what had happened to the Army contingent that had basically been under, they went in for an extraction mission, which totally fell apart. They were under siege for like almost 2 days, and the survivors finally emerged or were rescued from the wreckage. And we were left with picking up the pieces, rescuing who we could, humanitarian for the Somalian civilians. Their infrastructure was totally gone.
Wow.
The results of inhumanity, unfortunately, we got to see firsthand. I only say all that to say this is as close to actual combat as I was actually close to. And I say that in an humble way because I know contemporaries that were exposed to far worse. But from what I saw, that's as close as I ever want to be, because you saw corpses, both animal, human, in the streets. You saw just total devastation across the landscape that we were allowed to see. We provided aid and comfort not only to our Army brethren, the survivors, but we did humanitarian and rescue for some Somalians. Altogether, we were there 32 days. In inclusion to the time we spent off the coast of Bosnia, we were at sea continuously for 62 days. And that was my last deployment.
What a great story! This has been really interesting. Petty Officer First Class George Clark. We thank you very much.
Thank you.